Good afternoon, everyone, especially to our considerate and kind teacher, Ma'am Jody Cornelia. Good afternoon, ma'am. And to your classmates, good afternoon as well. So I am Christina Linihan, and I will be your last reporter for this group. I will be discussing the three learner-centered instruction as given by Egan and Chukchak. So the first one is learner at the center of the learning process. The second one is teacher guides students to construction of understanding. And the last characteristics that is part of the learner-centered instruction is teacher teach for understanding. So now let's discuss the first one. So the first one is learners are at the center of the learning process. So the criticisms of direct instruction have led educators to put more emphasis on the role of the students in the learning process. So many opted for a more student-centered environment as opposed to the traditional teacher-centered setup. So learners are given more choices. Learning activities are designed with the needs, interests, and developmental levels of the learners in foremost consideration. So the first one, or the first characteristic, simply mean that the role of the students in the learning process are given more emphasis as compared to the traditional learning or traditional teaching. So meaning to say, just like other things, the traditional setup or the direct instruction have faced a certain criticism. That is why it urged educators to give more emphasis on the side of the students or on the role of the students. So meaning to say, in the first one, it simply refers that the role of the teachers or the traditional teaching is no longer given emphasis, but it doesn't mean that they don't have the responsibility for the students' learning. The second characteristic talks about the teacher guides the learners or the guides students in the construction of understanding. So meaning to say, the role of the teachers here is, or the role of the teachers are, or they will act as a facilitator. Meaning to say, they are the so-called guide on the side rather than a sage on the stage. Meaning to say, as students, we are given the opportunity to discuss in front of the class, to present our ideas in front of the class, to actively engage in the different activities in the class, but the teacher will only guide us in our learning. They will just tell us the necessary things for us to be able to understand different concepts. So I hope you understand the second one. The third one is teachers teach for understanding. So students are placed at the center of the learning process. So the teachers help them to take responsibility for their learning. As a result, students, through their own active search and experimentation, experience a movement from confusion to searching for answers, discovery, and finally to understanding. So in the last one, teachers teach for understanding, meaning to say, the teachers will just only give certain activities and students will search for it, will investigate about it, will explore about it, and then finally they would lead to understanding. Meaning to say, just like for example, we are given research. So we search for that concept, we search for the certain ideas, and as we explore, as we go along with our investigation, with our exploration and research, we find to discover, okay, this is what is meant by that certain thing. So meaning to say, as we search, we discover, and as we discover, we understand. So now, before I will end the report, we have here a question to ponder. So in the teaching and learning process, why should be the students placed at the center? So I hope you can answer it on your own, since I already discussed the three characteristics of the learner-centered instruction. Thank you so much for listening, And once again, good afternoon, and may you always stay safe.
Good day everyone, I am Rica Rosoliva and I am one of the reporter for Module 26, which is revisiting the 14 learner-centered psychological principles. So my part there is to recall the 14 learner-centered psychological principles. So let's begin. So before we proceed, I will first read the learning outcomes for this module. So in this module, learners will be able to recall concepts on the 14 learner-centered psychological principles, describe the characteristic of learner-centered instruction, and appreciate the significance of the 14 principles as a sound framework for effectively facilitating learning, as well as the characteristics of learner-centered instruction. So, so So let us recall first on what is learner-centered psychological principles, or these 14 principles. So this was introduced to us by the American Psychological Association, or APA, in the year 1990s. Originally, there are 12 learner-centered psychological principles, but after 7 years it was revised and it has now 14 principles. So why is it named learner-centered psychological principles? It is because the researchers and theories of education were integrated that of the theories in researches in psychology. It was made in order to make or to design a new and more effective framework in education. And until now, it is integrated because the effectivity of it was observed in the educational systems, the teaching and the learning process. So, learning the 14 learner-centered psychological principle would help us understand the nature of learners and the nature of learning process as well. And with that knowledge, we will now have the idea on what strategies or approaches that we will use in order to maximize the learning of our students in order for us to become an effective teacher. So, and we as a future educator, our goal is to become an effective teacher. So the 14 learner-centered psychological principles was categorized into 4 categories. We have the cognitive and metacognitive factors, motivational and affective factors, developmental and social factors, and individual differences. So we're already familiar with these words that I read, which is the 4 category, because we have already discussed this in our module 2. So, and now we will focus on the 14 principles. So, as you can see in the screen, we have the first category, we have cognitive and metacognitive factors. So the first principle is the nature of the learning process. The learning of complex subject matter is most effective when it is an intentional process of constructing meaning from information and experience. So from the word intentional process, this is usually happening in a classroom or a class where our learning is mostly intentional because our teachers, when they come into the classroom, they have an end in mind already, or their learning objectives or learning outcomes for their students. So, and another important term there is constructing meaning. So, um, as educators or future educators, we go into the classroom not just to feed informations to our student, but we help our learners use the knowledge they acquire in order for them to construct meaning. We help them to become constructivists and become creators of knowledge and meaning, and of course with the guidance of the integration of effective strategies in teaching. Second principle, we have goals of the learning process. The successful learner, over time and with support and instructional guidance, can create meaningful, coherent representations of knowledge. So this is somewhat related to the first one, the first principle, goals of the learning process. So as an educator, future educator, um, we have to help our learners set their own goals. It's not only us teachers, us educators who sets the learning goals, but also the students or the learner. when the learners set their own learning goals, then they will become more committed in attaining that learning goal. The third principle, we have construction of knowledge. The successful learner can link new information with existing knowledge in meaningful ways. So learners learn a lot of things. Learners learn from different disciplines like science, math, English, and many more. So they also learn from the environment, from other people, from their family, relatives, and other people. And there are a lot of sources of knowledge, but this knowledge or discipline are not actually isolated. They're always connected with one another. So as teachers or educators, we have to help them connect the new lesson or new learning that they have to the previous learning or lessons that they have, so that they can construct meaningful learning. They must have the link. So how can we do that? We can use concept mapping, graphic organizer to represent the knowledge that they've acquired to that and link that to the previous lessons that they have. So there must be integration of lesson that they are studying. The fourth principle, we have strategic thinking. The successful learner can create and use a repertoire of thinking and reasoning strategies to achieve complex learning goals. So, I will give an example of an experience, and most of us have observed this during our when we have way back when we have our class. So, an example of an experience we have: if a teacher gives a complex task to its students, some of the students would really complain before they would comply, because for them they are thinking that it is very difficult to do, and a lot of reasons, they will give a lot of reasons. But a successful learner wouldn't complain because they have a strategic thinking. In the first glance, it is difficult, it is very difficult to attain, but a successful learner can make use of its strategic thinking on how they can achieve the task. So, an example of a task is a speech presentation. You, as a student, you are not into public speaking or speech presentation, and your teacher task uh, task you to be the representative for that speech presentation or public speaking. So usually you would complain, but a successful learner, if you are a successful learner, you would think of a strategy on how you can attain that task. So you would like you would practice in front of the mirror, or in front of your family, your relatives, or friends, and that's one of the ways that you are using your strategic thinking. So the fifth principle, we have thinking about thinking. Higher order strategies for selecting and monitoring mental operations facilitate creative and critical thinking. So thinking about thinking, or in other words, it is metacognition. So as students, we must have the ability to monitor our own learning and assess the strategies of learning, whether it is effective or not. If it is not effective, then think of another strategies to be applied in order to boost our learning. So if um if we, as a student, we need to think and think of another of a lot of strategies for us to apply and for us to boost our learning. The sixth principle, we have context of learning. Learning is influenced by environmental factors including culture, technology, and instructional practices. So we have three influenced by environmental factors. First, we have culture. As teacher or future educator, we must be sensitive with the culture. Let us make sure that whatever culture, background, and belief our students have, we must have to really accept those, and we must be sensitive with their culture because there must be equality in the classroom. The next influence we have technology. We have to use and maximize technology in order for us to boost learning. We can use technology for searching, for presenting our lesson, and many more. Last influence we have instructional practices. So the quality of teaching, the quality of the teachers really matters when it comes to learning. So those are the environmental factors. So these environmental factors really plays a very vital role in the learning of the students. So we really have to be sensitive with the environment and take advantage of the technology in order for learners to learn. So now we are now in the second category, motivational and affective factors. So the seventh principle, we have motivational and influences on learning. So what and how much is learned is influenced by the learner's motivation. Motivation to learn in turn is influenced by the individual's emotional states, beliefs, interests, and goals and habits of thinking. So motivation is just like our fuel to go on. It, it's like our fuel to exert effort in whatever we are doing because we exert effort because we enjoy it. We see its relevance and we know it's meaningful. So motivation must be sustained by the teachers. So it's the teacher who must sustain the who must give motivation to its student so that they will keep on exerting their effort in learning. So the influences there we have emotional state. So they must be motivated when they are learning. They must see and feel the enthusiasm in learning. Second influence, we have beliefs and interests. So as teacher, we must make sure that we present new to our students so their interest will be sustained. So we can adopt interactive activities so that they will be more interested by the lesson. So and set goals and beliefs and habits of thinking. So eighth principle, we have intrinsic motivation to learn. So the learner's creativity, higher order thinking, and natural curiosity all contribute to motivation to learn. Intrinsic motivation is stimulated by tasks of optimal novelty and difficulty, relevant to personal interest, and providing for personal choice and control. So, in these principles, so you need to think or you need to make sure that are your student curious on what they are studying or just nothing, they're just observing the lesson without curiosity to master the lesson. So you must really monitor if your students are curious on what is your lesson, because if they are not curious, they're just observing the lesson where they are not interested. So the lesson must be connected to their personal interest. The ninth principle, we have effects of motivation on effort. So, acquisition of complex knowledge and skills requires extended learners' effort and guided practice. Without learners' motivation to learn, the willingness to exert this effort is unlikely without coercion. So, I've already mentioned it earlier that if a learner is not motivated or if a learner is motivated, then they would extend effort or exert effort in doing certain tasks on accomplishing a learning task. So that's the reason why we must, as a future educator, we must sustain motivation to our future learners. That's okay. So now we are in the third category. We have developmental and social factors. So the 10th principle, we have developmental influences on learning. As individuals develop, there are different opportunities and constraints for learning. Learning is most effective when differential development within and across physical, intellectual, emotional, and social domains is taken into account. So, in other words, there must be holistic learning, not only cognitive cognitive level or cognitive aspects. It must be holistic, meaning students or learners must enhance physical aspects, intellectual aspects, emotional aspects, and social domains. The 11th principle, we have social influences on learning. Learning is influenced by social interactions, interpersonal relations, and communication with others. So we are not learning alone. We communicate with other people, classmates, teachers, our parents, and with the community. And as we communicate with them, we acquire knowledge and we learn something new we learn something new with our interaction with other people. That's why communication skill is very vital in learning. That's the influence of social factors of learning. Now we are on the last category, which is individual differences factors. So the 12th principle, we have individual differences in learning. Learners have different strategies, approaches, and capabilities for learning that are a function of prior experience and heredity. So, we all know that learners have different intelligence, right? They have different abilities, culture, background. So, in other words, they're not similar to each other. And so, as teachers or future educators, future teachers, we have to see to it that we sustain the needs of our future students, although there is a diversity in our classroom. The 13th principle, we have learning and diversity. Learning is most effective when differences in learners' linguistic, cultural, and social backgrounds are taken into account. So, as teachers or future educators, we have to consider that our students have different linguistic background, cultural background, so that they feel respected inside the classroom, and for that they will be more motivated to learn. Okay, if we are not considerate with their linguistic background or cultural background, then they will feel disrespected. So as a future educator, we really have to be sensitive, we really have to be understandable. Okay, so the last principle, we have the 14th principle, the standards and assessment. So setting appropriately high and challenging standards and assessing the learner as well as learning progress, including diagnostic process and outcomes assessment, are integral parts of the learning process. So why I why is assessment and standard important in educator? And some student and me also, I am admitted that I really hate that that there would be assessment after the lesson. But I have now realized that as a future educator, we really have to let really have to or we need to let our student realize, or our future student realize, that it is very important, assessment is very important, because that would tell a lot what it comes to their learning. So what they have learned already in the lesson, what uh what part of the lesson, or that if they have understand the lesson. So assessment must be used to help their students know what fields do they need to learn more and how far they have learned already. So, and we have to remember that we have to set standard as well. Standard is one of important things that we need to set. So assessment must not be very easy. If assessment is very easy and you always gets perfect score, and your student always gets perfect score, because the assessment is um very easy, your student must complain, or we as a student, we need to complain if our assessment is very easy, because we are not learning from that. We are not learning something new for that. But and also, if the assessment is very hard also, we also need to complain because an ideal assessment must be one step ahead of the current level of the students. If the assessment is too hard for us, then for us students or for our future students, that would read out um, the poor students. Only those are only those who are advanced would excel. So the poor students they cannot excel if the assessment is too hard. So that's all. That's the 14 learner-centered psychological principles. So question to ponder. By revisiting on the concepts of the 14 learner psychological principles, as a future educator, why is it important to consider those in facilitating the teaching? So, facilitating learning should firmly anchored on the 14 learner-centered psychological principles. The 14 principles espouse that everyone in the learning community is a learner, not just the students. So, I am done with my part. Let us now go to the next reporter.